Recording in progress.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Regeneration podcast. And I'm your co-host, Michael Martin. And I just see my buddy Mike Sauter just took a seat. Let's go, Mike.
Yeah, I was setting up our guest today in a different office, and then I ran to this. It's almost like a little broom closet, so we don't have feedback. It's a good friend of mine, a priest of the Most Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church, Father Ed Dillon. And today we're going to talk about a subject, and I'll kind of seed it based on an anecdote. We're going to talk about monasticism, and the reason I brought it up with Michael yesterday was there was a I thought it was funny. I know, but Michael tweets a lot on monasticism, and in his books, for people who read his books, it filters in and weaves in through all of his books. I would say.
I don't write about.
Go ahead.
I don't write about monasticism. I write about marriage.
Okay.
And monasticism comes into the conversation.
Excellent. No,
you know
that's a great contextualization. So the text yesterday had somebody on Twitter, Father Ed, somebody will post an image frequently, and they have comments and so forth. But somebody posted an image of a really holy, like Orthodox, I think it was Orthodox personage. I don't know if he was a saint, but the anecdote was that this monk was born and his mom died in childbirth, and that this holy man of God lived for 74 years.
83 years.
He never ever set eyes on a woman. So then what followed in his whole life? So what followed was all these kind of comments, kind of praising that. Wow, how holy that is and how awesome. Then I'm scrolling through and I see my good friend Michael had contributed to the conversation with one word and one word only. And he left the word psychopath on that. So how about Michael, you kind of reflect on that anecdote, and then we'll bring Father Ed Dillon into the conversation. Yeah.
Well, you see this with like some traddy Catholics, for instance, or you see it with the ortho bros, where they say stuff like that, and it's absurd. I mean, it's crazy. That should not be something that's celebrated. That he's never seen a woman in his whole life. I mean, that's a pathological state of being. I mean, one of the things I love to rip on in my work is the monks of Mount Athos. Where feminine, the feminine of the species, whatever species, is not allowed on the island. I don't know how they handle birds and insects, but apparently, they can't bring a cow onto the island, or a hen, or a woman.
And I've definitely heard that too. Do you think it's changed, or we think this is still the reigning?
It hasn't changed. No? And get this. So a friend of mine, really good friend of mine, was in the Foreign Service. This is probably back in the 80s, maybe early 90s. And he wanted to go, he happened to be stationed in Greece, and they had one child, he and his wife, and she was pregnant with another. And he goes, I'm going to go visit Mount Athos. Since we're here, I might as well do it, right? So he goes over there, and he gets into conversation with this monk who tries, and he wasn't even Orthodox, he was Catholic. And he goes over, this monk's trying to talk him in to leaving his wife and children and becoming a monk. And my friend said, well, that's not right. We can arrange it. It's not, wouldn't be a sin for you. So it's pathological. I mean, I don't think monasticism is pathological, but I think things like you saw yesterday on Twitter and what my friend experienced on Mount Athos, that's insane.
I agree. Okay, so let's pause here, and I'm going to bring in Father Ed Dillon. Father Ed is a friend that our listeners might know, that on and off again, currently redoing it as a layman under a certain canon in canon law. I've run, and now I'm running again, our local Catholic parish. And when I began in upstate New York, when I began my first foray, actually I knew Father Ed Dillon. I'd been in campus ministry, and he was assigned to our parish in senior priest status, and served the community. We became fast friends, and people in the parish would say we drank from the same Kool-Aid cup. Father Ed, I would characterize as kind of an Irish wit, really intelligent guy, studied over in Rome. Father Ed, don't be too brief either. Give us a little bit of your background, and then kind of weave it into, maybe some reflections on monasticism. Where you come from, things you think people might be interested to know.
I have a lot of trouble trying to describe my life. It doesn't really make much sense to me. But, you know, I don't worry about that. And I'm able to function in some place, somehow. And I've always had good friends along the way that helped me be useful. And I'm probably some type of a scholar because I used to read a lot. And I was interested in everything that was happening. Also in the church, but not exclusively or even primarily in the church. And one of the ways I made money for a few years was doing research on monasteries and telling their story. And I must have done, 150 monasteries in the Western world, in Europe mostly. And I would get to know the resources you have to check out to do that. And I would tell the story of the monasteries, typically founded by some saint, flourished, enjoyed their flourishing state, declined, and then died. And then a couple centuries later, another zealous group took over that monastery and formed a new monastery. And so it went on and on and on. And I'm reminded of what Chesterton said in one of his books, that the church has died at least 5 times. And then just when people are ready to blow the bugle over the grave, they look up, see this strange thing coming over the hill. It's really weird, but yet somehow the same. And it's the church alive and well again. And the monasteries become alive and well again. And as time goes on, this is my way of viewing the history of the Western church, at least, but I think the East is similar. The Imperial Church flourished in the 4th century when Constantine became a Christian. Already the church had taken on all the flavor, feeling, and style and values of the Roman Empire. And so by the time of Constantine, it was just natural for the church to become the church of the empire. And so you have the Imperial Church, whose name is the Catholic Church. That's what Catholic Church means. It's the church of the empire, especially when it became the only religion allowed in the empire. So it left the Persian model of empire, which encouraged people to be faithful to their traditions, their language, their culture, their heroes, and their religion. And the Persians would even help them go home to their ruined towns and cities and build them up again. But just remember to pay your taxes in a timely way to the great king of Persia. So a new and enlightened form of empire came when Persia came on the scene. And in the book of Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, Cyrus the Great, we call him, is called by God, my Messiah. You are my Messiah, and you do the things I want you to do, though you know me not. About 3 times it describes Cyrus the Great that way. For the first time, one of the kings of the world is called by God, my Messiah. So this is a new form of empire. And the empire that followed, not right away, but eventually, was Rome. And they were following the Persian model. They didn't care what your religion was. They encouraged you to build an altar and have a priesthood for that God of yours, as long as you pay your taxes in a timely way and respect and honor our emperor. When the empire became Christian, it became intolerant and abandoned the Persian model. That imperial church died in the West in the year 576, so they say. And what replaced it, and it had been replacing it for a century or more, were the monasteries. The monks were the source of life and the guardians of the great tradition. And the monks created little islands of peace in the midst of chaos. when the empire disintegrated, law and order was gone. And you had roving bands of barbarians, as Gregory the Great calls them. And the one response of the church, this new church, the monastic church, to the strangers in their midst was hospitality. That's all they did. They offered hospitality. You want to live in an island of peace in the midst of this chaos, which has made you crazy? You're welcome. And you can stay as long as you want, unless you become a threat to one of the other guests. Then two of the stouter brothers will take you to the furthest gate and point you along the way. Now, learn from your mistake now, next time you're provided with hospitality. So hospitality was the technique of the monks of Christianizing the world without realizing it. And so that 1,000, they say, towns and cities of Europe are built around monasteries. And these towns incorporated the rhythm of the monastic life, the bells ringing at dawn, at noon, and at sunset, and the feasts of the year celebrated, the festivals of the monks become the festivals of the towns. And it was an incredible act of civilization they did, and what the English would call later regarding themselves. In a fit of absent-mindedness, they created Europe. And just like the British, in a fit of absent-mindedness, controlled the world, the seas and all the continents in it. When you're about something else, you accomplish what you never thought of doing.
Interesting. Let's hold there for a little bit. You know, where do you think, and we want to go back to history, and whenever you talk about St. Gregory the Great too, it's very eloquent to me. But let's interject here again, you know, because I think you two kind of going back and forth is going to be great education for me. And again, my contribution here is that I've worked at a monastery for 6 years or something, running the retreat house at the Trappist Abbey, the Genesee. And I can only say my experience there was very powerful. But you know, they're not seeing many novices now. There's some interest, but you know, for them, you do have some of the novices could be the equivalent of these guys who, especially during COVID, you know, were living in their parents' basement. Mom might come down the stairs and say, "Hey, Huselfritz, you know, you need to get a job." And then Huselfritz says, "I think I'm called to be a monk," you know, and then that's not going to work. They show up at the Abbey of the Genesee, and these guys are willing to take a look at them, but it doesn't last long, right? You know, but Mike, interject again. I think there's going to be a good interplay here, because you and Father Ed have been talking. Oh, what else do you like? Continue with your kind of analysis of monasticism vis-a-vis marriage a little bit. You know, we'll kind of get this point counterpoint.
Well, I like like Father Ed said, you know, it was a popular book, but I thought it was really good. Called I can't remember the author's name. Popular author. How the Irish Saved Civilization.
Father Ed has it memorized, I think.
Yeah. It's a great book.
Thomas Cahill.
Thomas Cahill, yeah. Great book. And my favorite TV show from the BBC, Tudor Monastery Farm, you know. And I think all the things Father said are true. You know, the monasticism through the early Middle Ages up until the Reformation for sure was the civilizing influence on Western civilization. I don't know about the East so much, but I do know about the West. I don't know what happened though. You know, and not only that, but I think, you know, even if you go back, and I don't think Tertullian was a monk, but where it gets weird for me is when monks started waxing theological about marriage, like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, for instance. He has a multi-volume, I mean, it's huge, sermons on the Song of Songs. And it's a fascinating document of the time, but it's really a window into monasticism, because you read it and then you read the Song of Songs. Like, does he talk about the same book? Isn't it about marriage? And is it essentially about marriage? And which is interesting to me because, and we all know, the image of the bride and the bridegroom, speaking theologically. But it seems to me that somewhere along the way, and Father can tell me if I got this right or wrong, I think with the acquisition and the growth of power by not necessarily monasticism, but with a clerical culture that was raised or nurtured in monasticism, what happens is you get, and this is, I mean, my Catholic education as a kid was, here's the highest thing you could be, boys and girls, a priest or a nun. But if that doesn't work out, maybe you can get married, and that's almost good, but you can do that, right? So you get that hierarchical notion of sacramental ways of living, right? And then accompanying with this, and I'm sure this is something that came out of monastic, like Bernard on the Song of Songs, out of monastic application of ideas, with the idea of the Holy Family and the perpetual virginity of Mary. I mean, that's held up as to you as a kid in Catholic school, and then you realize I will never live up to this model ever. So I mean, I don't know where that comes from, and you even go back to Tertullian in his book De Cultu Feminarum, which is on the clothing of women, and he says this, and it's in my book, Sophia in Exile. He says, "Do you not know you are Eve? The sentence of God on this sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt of necessity lives too. You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law." That's a heavy thing to lay on, my wife, right? I bet if he said that to my wife, she would probably slap him. But
Michael has 9 children, Father Ed.
Well, the scriptures are not much better. If you read Genesis, the curse to Eve is just horrible. I wish I haven't been able to see for 6 years. I wish I could read it to you. But you know the story, right?
yeah, oh, absolutely.
Serpent. Yeah. Where, Adam, where are you? I heard you walking in the garden, and I hid myself because I'm naked. Who told you you're naked? You've eaten then of the fruit of which I forbade you to eat, lest you die? Remember that helpmate you gave me? You thought I shouldn't be alone? Well, I ate. And to the woman, he says, why did you do such a thing? And she says, the serpent tricked me, so I ate. And God doesn't question the serpent. He just curses the serpent. Because you've done this, cursed shall you be among all the beasts of the earth. On your belly you will crawl, dust you will eat. I will put hostility between you and the woman, between your seed and hers. You will strike at his heel while he crushes your head. And then, having dealt with the serpent, he goes to the woman. Because you have done this, you will bring forth children in great pain and labor. All your desire will be for a man to rule over you. So she gets cursed. Labor pains are the curse, and the addiction to male leadership is a curse. And to the man, he doesn't curse Adam. He says, cursed be the earth because of you. In the sweat of your brow, you will bring forth bread from the earth all the days of your life, until you return to the dust from which you came. Dust you are, and unto dust you shall return. So that's a pretty terrible story.
Yeah.
And it's foundational. It's foundational to Judaism, Christianity, and probably Islam.
Yeah, but how about this? Like the claim would be, and I'm not trying to be devil's advocate, but you mentioned Chesterton before. Doesn't somebody like in that Chestertonian vein usually retort that, sure, we had our problems and Aquinas had his issues and all that stuff, but we were still light years ahead of the other cultures and so forth. I'm not so sure what that does, but isn't that kind of the apologetics approach to what we're talking about today?
I think the apologetic approach would be it's state of the art of being human in almost any primitive culture, where the male domination is taken for granted, and you have to give a nice pious story to show why it is so. So I think it's not ahead of the others or behind the others. It is the others. I think this is the human approach to family, to life on earth, and to the human condition. I don't know enough about other cultures. Now, there are great historians of culture that I have read. I've read 3 of them. I tried to read a 4th without much success.
How old are you, Father Ed?
86.
Okay. Continue.
Okay. Now, Chesterton might try to make Christianity look superior, and I think that's a healthy impulse, to some extent. But also, though, I think it shouldn't turn you off from learning from all the cultures you come across. Especially if they still survive in spite of Christianity's dominance of the world. But the thing I love about monasticism is that it was the real church when the Imperial Church died of its own weight. In the West, the Imperial Church died in 576, the last Roman Empire, the last influence of the empire in the West. In the East, just a century later, most of the Christian great cultures, Egypt, Syria, and others, died before the onslaught of Islam. That the Islam wiped out the ancient churches, except for Constantinople and its empire. It's very, very diminished empire. But other than that little island, the Imperial Church died. Now, I love the description of Macaulay in the 18th century, I think it was, or 19th. What is your Roman church but the ghost of the Roman Empire, crowned and seated among the ruins thereof? If you look upon the Roman church as the Imperial Church, it had a short history and merely survives in a pathetic way. But the real church, the vital church, was the monastery. And like Michael says, the monastic tradition was flawed from the beginning, but it still housed the heart of Christianity in many respects, and especially in that one great thing, hospitality. You welcome the stranger as Christ and give him the benefit of the doubt until he threatens the welfare and the life, perhaps, of another guest. And then you have to give a little distance between him and you. Point him down the road. And the monks, look at what the monks achieved. It's kind of ludicrous in some respects, copying books they can't even understand. And they did a terrible job. They couldn't even copy the scriptures often with any, when you compare it with the Jews preserving the Hebrew literature, Hebrew writings, they're done to perfection. And when you get the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find examples of Isaiah the prophet, which is almost perfectly identical with the Masoretic text, which Jews use today, and when Christians use as the basis of their translations. An incredibly accurate preservation of the script, whereas in the Christian world, the monks laboring conscientiously over texts they don't understand often, did a half-assed job of preserving it, and yet you can kind of correlate and find out what the original text might have been, And even today we have 3 main renditions of the New Testament that have been preserved from the 4th century, approximately. The Vatican one, which is considered the best, the one from Sinai, which is second, and then Alexandria, the third. And scholars kind of compare these three, and they still have great diversities of opinion regarding the authentic text of St. Luke or the Acts of the Apostles or some of the other books that have many variant texts. So it's like a real game to try to establish the authentic versions of even the teachings of Jesus because of the much poorer job that Christians did in preserving the sacred text compared to the Jews.
Interesting. Now let me say too that when we look, if we go kind of the history of monasticism, kind of where it is now, and maybe what could be its future. You could have monks listening to this and saying, like, what do these guys think they're talking about? Well, I'm going to say this is that I think one of the things that's kind of fallen away in modern culture is that maybe since the Industrial Revolution, but we just have a causal view of history. Everything is seen as a domino effect. And I'm constantly reminding, so the gene determines everything in the surrounding environment. And working at a college, I'm kind of reminding the young people that we're always looking for an Archimedean point, a leverage. It's part of the modern mindset to see where everything else follows. But epigenetics suggests that the gene determines things outside of it, and yet the environment of the gene affects the genes. You smile when you're happy, and when you smile, it makes you happy. People have chosen that. And so monasteries too, I know in our own diocese at the Abbey of the Genesee, that in our best we could see that the monastery influences the surrounding environment, and the surrounding environment influences the monastery. We have, right now there's an image used for a monastery that I've heard in our diocese, and it's called like a Powerhouse of Prayer. And I don't know, I bet you that has fructifying elements to it, but I just don't like it. It kind of is this domino effect that the monastery is a self-enclosed place, and from there, things just kind of flow out and influence. And what I'd like to see, I think, for the health of all of our monasteries, is for everybody to step back and see kind of the push and pull factors, that again, so many monasteries in this country are seeing an elderly population. That's true of the Abbey of the Genesee. And so they necessarily have to withdraw, and they kind of, pull in their sails a little bit. But then that leads to the deterioration of their relationships with the surrounding communities. And then I think we get a snowball effect. But, Michael, can you reflect on that a little bit, or does it make you think of what you're seeing?
Well, I don't know. Well, here's the thing. I think what Father Ed's describing as the medieval model of the monastery, right? Which that would flow out into the broader community easily, when you had a unified culture, right? Now we don't. And I don't think I even knew there was such a thing as a monastery until I was about 18 years old. At least that there were still monasteries around. My parents brought me to one. It was actually it was a beautiful Franciscan monastery, but even then, I mean, in fact, my wife and I, when we first met, we would go there and we'd pray the rosary, and they closed down in about 1992 because of exactly what you were describing. They had a demographic winter visited upon them, and it was a beautiful place. We were at the last mass that was offered there, but this is connected to a lot of things I think about in terms of distributism and how communities should be alive. And maybe Father Ed doesn't know this, but I'm a organic farmer. And for me, small is beautiful, and I like the idea of a small communities. And then if say there was a monastery, and there are a couple of monasteries, they're Orthodox, not too far from here, integrated into that community, and that community integrated into the life of the monastery. But that's not what's been going on for the longest time, as you just described, Mike. It's the idea that kind of persists. It's kind of a ghost in a way. And I think, and tell me if this is true, this is just my perception from the outside, is that, as you mentioned, Mike, that a lot of people who are attracted to monastic life now, and I know some women monks these nuns who are just lovely people, but I wonder if that kind of retreat, it's interesting. So a lot of people will choose that life to retreat from the life of the world, whereas the hospitality model that Father was talking about, the medieval model, that had a more of a fructifying effect on the culture, the micro culture around it, right? So I don't know what to do about it.
I've got some thoughts, and then Father Ed can reflect. But again, working there, so another image is, again, a hospital. I'm always writing about, and I'll be very candid, like in my writing, that we almost need to recast, the gospel language from religious language of do something good to get to place A called heaven as opposed to place B called hell, but cast it more in the terms of healing or almost like therapeutics and so forth. That when we hear the story about a woman whose blood boiled and there was a cure for that, every young person, everybody who's struggling with mental health or anxiety, a person who's paralyzed, we could think of addiction, and they were set free by the healing of Christ, that monasteries could be those hospitals again. I have a lot to say, like in favor of the monasteries, including the Abbey of the Genesee, that at this time where we're addicted to our devices and so forth, I would give retreat talks at the monastery. And, it's kind of a talking point are the monks running from the world, or are we running from the, monasticism? Meaning that, most young people or most people in our culture today, can't sit with themselves, and just see what's arising. And so much of the practice there at the Abbey of the Genesee is doing that, asceticism, like seeing what's in me and dealing with all these demons we have, as opposed to just keeping them down and getting a full-time job. And when you don't deal with these things, think of the net effects out in the world. You have issues that you're trying to hide, so you become a workaholic. That leads actually to economic despoliation and so forth. So, I'm just trying to keep everything afloat, because we're not here to and nobody's doing it, beating up on monasteries. So I do agree that I don't think they're engaged with their surrounding communities enough in that way. Right now, even when I have this image that they could be a place for healing, the local abbey offers confessions. I suppose that's good. I'm not so sure there's any verifiable proof that monks make better confessors than others. I know some really damn good ones over there. Mm-hmm. But, there is this hope too that, we need monasteries now just so for some people who could go inward. Look at Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk making all these rockets, phallic symbols everywhere. So it's a common trope that started with Dostoevsky and people pick up. The real journey is inward. Cast all those stupid rockets into the netherworld. Like, we need rockets to go inside, but so Father Ed, what are you hearing, and what does it bring up in you? You're something of a poet as well as a historian.
First of all, monasteries gave birth to new kinds of monasteries, like the Franciscans and Dominicans. These orders of poor men went out to people. Like the Dominicans went out to preach the gospel to the people in Europe. And Francis offered hospitality to the most despised, to lepers and to outcasts. So it's a new kind of monastic thing, a brotherhood that is open to the most needy of the world. And Dominicans were the intellectual, or at least they wanted to free people from dangerous thinking, as they saw it. And the Franciscans were just hospitality to the most despised. And that grew, a new kind of a monastic life grew. Franciscans then became third order Franciscans, people living in the world like King Louis IX and Queen, what's her name, of Scotland? Margaret. Of Scotland. They were really Franciscans who were living the ideal of using your gifts for the poor and living a simple life yourself. It infected the whole environment. And then as time went on, the Reformation, in response to the Reformation, you have these great saints who reinvented pastoral ministry, but in a monastic way, with friends who would gather with them. Like St. Vincent de Paul, his life is just fantastic. But he went out to the most despised people, the poor people of Paris and prisoners in the galleys. And his order did that. And then you had Francis de Sales, a worldly man in the best sense. He befriended everyone he met, Calvinist or Catholic, on their journey and encouraged them on their journey of faith. I mean, a whole different idea of what a bishop is or any kind of pastoral minister. And then you have like people like Francis, what's his name in Italy? Don Bosco, who took the name Salesians for his brothers because he so admired Francis de Sales. And they took care of the pre-delinquent boys. That they would be criminals in another 2 years if no one takes care of them. And Ursula, what was her name? Saint Ursula
of Sweden.
The one in Italy that took care of the poor girls.
Girls, yeah.
Oh, the Ursulines, right? Is that the religious order?
Yeah.
I've forgotten names of things and people. So the monastic ideal was already formed in a different way, going out to the most needy of the world while remaining a Christian community. They wouldn't do this alone. No one would do it individually. You do it with the help of your friends. Today's feast is St. Peter Claver. He gathered friends of his who shared his horror of slavery. And when the new slave ships came into Colombia, they would go down and work their way through the slave traders and these brutal people to find the slaves that were cast off as useless because they were so injured and they were probably dying. And they would soothe them and bathe them, get them to trust them, and feed them, and even turn cold ones that are turning cold toward death, warming them, and finally buying them for like 2 pennies because they're worthless, and taking them with them. And some of them survived to be part of their community. So Peter Claver is just, I think, he made a vow as a young person too. He vowed, promised God he would become a slave to the slaves the rest of his life. And his brothers and others, I'm sure there were women with them who did the same thing, greeting the slave ships as they came in and dealing with the discards, the refuse, even of the slaves. It was just incredible. Now, you can call him a psychopath, and he probably was, I mean, some sense of the word, but he was also a saint. You know, what he did is just incredible, and he persevered for many years. I knew a nun in Philadelphia, took the name Sister Peter Claver, lived to be 105. She was the first person to give Dorothy Day $10 to start the Catholic Worker, a newspaper, and she was with Dorothy during the early days of her revolution there in New York City.
Actually, speaking of Dorothy Day, one of my best friends, the godmother of my second oldest, her mother was one of those the first flock of Dorothy Day. And when I met my friend, this is 30 years ago, she hired me as her gardener. And she referred me to her mom. She wanted me to, I wasn't making much money. So she referred me to her mother, and I would go over and she would talk about Dorothy Day, and I'd go over to work. She'd say, Michael, we're not going to work today. We're just going to come in and have tea and read Dante. And, and she would tell me all these first generation stories of Dorothy Day. And that's it. And Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker movement, is that a monastic movement?
I would think so.
Yeah, you know what I mean? I
know that Father Ed to college students, when people are, especially Rod Dreher, so fond, as they should be, of quoting Alistair McIntyre's, famous words at the end of After Virtue. You point out the trajectories we're on with ideology and the crisis of postmodernity, but he makes a claim that we need a new and different Saint Benedict. And I remember at a mass with college students, Father Ed, that you were thinking in real time, and we still hope for it, but maybe it is this Dorothy Day thing, who also had a great and wonderful relationship with the Abbey of the Genesee, a well-known one. Father John Hughes Bamberger, the abbot, was sending a lot of money down there, and she stayed up at the Abbey of the Genesee many times. Yeah, no, it's this is a wild legacy. And Dorothy Day brings us to, some conversations on the future of monasticism. And I think we've surfaced some themes already, hospitality. Just at breakfast the other day, I've been newly appointed to run a parish again, and Father Ed can say, as they say, speaks with authority. But like the new church, let's say we're in one of Chesterton's 6th or 7th or 8th deaths of the church, it will be formed around hospitality, no doubt. But a couple of other things that I think can be seeds for conversation is, I think of pretty insane. Talk about psychopaths, Joaquin Fiore, who Dante cast him pretty low. I still love that guy with a passion.
Yeah, me too.
But he had a model for a religious order that had kind of what we're looking for, I think, is, a dance, women and men living in proximity. The Gilbertines that were suppressed at the Reformation. I don't know as much about them as I want to, but it seemed to be a promising new form of monasticism that had this great dance between the male and the female. And Father Ed, one more thing, is that he's the one who, his professor, Father Flood over in Rome, who had the great Franciscan poem of all time, that is, do you want to say the poem, Father Ed?
St. Francis implied, though not with words, that religion is for the birds.
Isn't that great? But the same one, Mike, and it ties it back to when we had, I thought you'd love that, Michael. It's so great. It's a keeper. But this same Father Flood, when we ended a conversation with our friend Tara Teak a few weeks ago, Father Ed gave me the line that I love so much. No civilization has survived 3 generations of co-education. That to me, what that phrase symbolizes, and it's very fructifying, we've used that word a lot for me, is that culture, newness, and creativity, which is different than cleverness, which Michael skewers so well when he talks about like Disney movies made by committee and things. But creativity is always going to come from this kind of, the polarity of the male and the female. And to that end, and I don't have the details right, but I think I heard stories over at the Abbey of the Genesee. There's a famous Trappist writer right now. Did they call him the new Thomas Merton? But his name is Michael Casey, an abbot of Tarawara Abbey in Australia. And he's definitely worth reading. He's great, all of his books. But I'm going to call it a Festschrift, but in kind of an in-Trappist journal, a lot of people reflecting on the future of their order. And again, all of this is secondhand for me. And forgive me, any Trappists. We got a lot of Trappist listeners, I'm sure. Just kidding. But that he said, in the future, almost as if down the road, we'd probably need a Trappistine community near a Trappist community. And I thought that was a wholesome striving, right? It's so that there can be this kind of cross-fertilization. It's widely known in the Trappist community that the Trappistines have much more joy in their communities. When they have recreation days, they know how to go out and celebrate in nature with picnics and things. Or I know my own Trappist won't mind me for saying this. They look to the Trappistines as models of what community can be. But so, if we move a little bit to the future of monasticism, those are some of the things I see from my experience there.
And plus, in the late Middle Ages, with the rise of the Beguines and the Begards, which they couldn't get sanction from the church to form their own, to form a new order or a new community. So they were kind of lay monastic orders, but without being an order. And so I think some of the most beautiful mysticism of the Middle Ages came from these. And of course, then Marguerite Porretta was burned as a heretic, unfortunately. But there were like Magdeburg, what's her name, Hadewich of Magdeburg, and people like that, which I quote them in my book at length and often. So I think, I think part of the attraction, I think, even for modern, especially for modern disaffected people who are attracted to monastic life, it's, I would think, even more an attraction toward community.
That's it.
You know what I mean? Which is what we don't have any place. I mean, that's what we've been trying to create here on my farm. And we're starved for community. And I think if you look at the Middle Ages, the community in the late Middle Ages, this is after getting away from the marauding, what was the word you used, Father?
Barbarians?
the barbarians. Yeah. Besides, well, we're kind of surrounded by our whole culture is barbaric now.
Roving bands of barbarians.
Roving bands of barbarians. But so when it got after the monasteries were settled, there was this reciprocity between those monastic with monasteries and the community around it, right? So there was community on both sides of that, and they were both parts of the same community.
Yeah.
And which we don't have at all now. Most people don't know the names of their next door neighbors. So, and I think there's a real hunger to have that. And I think, when Roger wrote his book, The Benedict Option, I think if this is fearful as the underpinning of that book was, I think, one thing that's sound there is that people want to be connected to something real and have their faith connected to the world and to what they do in the world, and not just be abstracted away from reality. So, and I think and people come and I think part of the problem was, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that when societies and cultures moved away from agrarian models and more toward urban models, that's when it all fell apart.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Say more, Father Ed.
Well, William Blake,
I do know.
he just epitomizes that. I mean, his description of what happened to human communities because of the Industrial Revolution. But the little villages and around a church, right? The Methodist church, especially in our area, every little hamlet has a Methodist church, and it's in the heart of things. And so were the Catholic churches of Europe. They were in the heart of, and the villages grew up around the cathedrals and the other churches, and the monasteries too. But think of St. Luke describing the early Christian. He claims anything as his own, but is shared by the whole community according to their need. I forget how he said it, but I mean, he had a great description. It's a community that shares everything, men, women, and children, and that is what I've experienced myself 2 different times. One in Philadelphia, and I will describe it sometime if you're interested, but then another time in Rochester, where once we decided to take in the homeless and feed them every day, the whole parish was transformed. And people came in out of the woodwork, barely making it, barely surviving. The poorest were the most generous, and they wanted to take part in this community. Men and women, young and old, and it survived until it was killed by a more enlightened person. When the pastor leaves, with the help of the diocese, of course. And then in Rochester, too, a very similar thing. And in each case, the secret was a saint at the heart of it. A priest that was so humble, joyful, and
well, even like Saint Francis, right? When Saint Francis left to save the Sultan, and he came back and he saw that the monks had organized things, and how he was disgusted by how opulent things were becoming, and he sat down on the floor and threw ashes on his food, and he wouldn't participate anymore because they'd sold out, right?
Yeah. And that's what we do again and again. And we choose comfort and respectability over vitality.
And that's interesting. I mean, I think, so for me, one of the things I've been interested in is, like I said, for me, it's always connected to this issue of marriage. And I think I've written more about marriage than almost any other topic. And it's because I've been married for 30 years and I still don't understand it. But it's a mystery. It really is. It's a mystery.
The central mystery of any culture.
Yes. And it's, let's face it, the Bible starts with the mystery of marriage and ends with the mystery of marriage.
Yeah.
Right. So what's intriguing to me and kind of disappointing is not just monasticism, but what happens when power comes to monasticism, or monks move into positions of power, and even and which is, and I don't know what to make of this, and I think it's just it's the part of the human condition. Power corrupts, absolutely. Though I love the story of when, in fact, one of the monasteries I did go to as a young man. In fact, I used to go to confession there when I was a Waldorf teacher, at St. Bonaventure's Monastery in Detroit, which is where Father Solanus was. Father Solanus was dead before I was born, but my father is here because of Father Solanus, because my grandparents were having trouble in their marriage, and they went to see Father Solanus. He said, "Oh, you gotta have another kid," which ended up being my dad. So I'm here because of Father Solanus. So I used to go and thank him. But so the story I was going to is when so that kind of humility you see in a real saint. Father Solanus was definitely a real saint. And then the story of Saint Bonaventure, when they brought him his cardinal's hat. You know this one, Mike?
No.
He's washing dishes, and they go, "We've, this committee from Rome comes, we've brought your hat for the cardinal. Hey, thanks a lot. Just hanging on that tree, okay? I'm busy washing the dishes."
Yeah.
Which is why when you see the emblem of Saint Benedict, it's a cardinal's hat hung on a tree.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
So that, I can live with those images, and I love Saint Bonaventure in particular.
Yeah. I think that the key word again, community. Father Ed almost jumped out of his chair, but it's also, that we had a young student who Father Ed has met, Hunter, on last week. And he was echoing in campus ministry. It's just it's the first thing that hits you when you walk out the door. Again, is this mental health crisis. But so at the microcosmic level, the college will say, and I can tie this to monasticism, but college will say we can't hire ourselves out of this problem, right? But to take at the macrocosmic level, that's also a symbolic statement. You can't hire yourself out of this problem, because the answer to addiction, the answer to so many of these things that are the besetting young people, is community. And that's where, like, the AA model, how do they fight addiction? They build community, right? They talk about the 12 steps, but really the 12 steps is about building community and so forth. So it's almost, we have this urgent sense for community, and yet community is something that's by nature organic. Father Ed, you study these things historically, community, and I think you have a lot of great reflections. You've even mentioned one time regarding the Abbey, the Genesee, like Father Ed's thinking in real time, we're having breakfast, and if we could just get, in one of the retreat houses, maybe 6 guys, suffering from one of these horrible imperial wars of conquest in American recent past, but PTSD from maybe veterans of Afghanistan. You start building around somebody like that. So monasteries, Father Ed said, in the inner city, you take in the homeless. But just picture one of these old monasteries, and some people, again, these young guys that, again, might be living in their parents' basements, who do yearn to connect with the land, that it could be founded around, getting 6 guys who need some support, suffer maybe PTSD, and all that you need to support them, and you learn from them. And, they would love to be near livestock and animals. Father Ed, you've talked about this eloquently at times.
I don't know where to begin.
Yeah.
Well, you just mentioned livestock. I had to check on my cows. I moved them to the parish behind, or to the pasture behind me.
Yeah.
But I think it's good to know that we have to begin again. We're going to begin at the beginning. So we have to figure out, where does it all begin? And we'll have different solutions, but I think if there's sanity involved in the quest, it'll come up to forming community that's grounded in the earth.
Mm-hmm. What Dillon Thomas calls the first spinning place. Right.
It's beautiful. Yeah. So, Father Ed has an appointment in a little while. We'd like to have you back again, Father Ed. He's got a wealth of wisdom on a lot of things. But I think we kind of visited this in a decent way. Any concluding thoughts, friends, on this? I kind of like that notion. We have to begin at the beginning. We're all recognizing nobody's heard malice in our voices. Nobody's heard good riddance, but we're looking at something that's going through a dying process right now. And we're looking at a beginning. And that can sound, that can sound defeatist to some. It's not, because death is a part of life. That's the idea. Simone Weil was always great, looking at truth and falsehood on a larger body of truth, death and life on a larger body of life, capital L, and all these things, and that, the trials and travails of monasticism are subsumed in kind of a larger narrative. But the virtues of community, cooperation, they're the timeless things. Concluding words from my Irish poet friends, Father Ed and Michael Martin.
God bless the monks. God bless the nuns. God bless us all.
That's great. On that note, we want to thank everybody to listening to the Regeneration Podcast. When I sign off, I'm going to run into an office near me where Father Ed is, and I'm going to hit the stop record. We will see everybody again next week. Mike, the farm this week, what's going
on? Today, I have so much to do, but I have to spin out some honey today. I harvested some honey a couple of weeks ago, and it's been sitting in my kitchen in these 2 giant boxes. And my wife keeps saying, "Is that stuff going to be here forever?"
What kind of cheese did you make this week? I saw big jars.
I made ricotta and farmer's cheese.
Yeah.
And it's a little too cold. I mean, I really like making hard cheeses, but it's a little too cold in the basement right now. But I think in a few weeks, it'll be the right temperature. So I'll go back to making hard cheeses.
Awesome.
Which is
You'll
fun.
see me. Keep talking for a second, Michael.
Okay. And then I'm talking for a second. So anyway, yeah. So there's so much to do.
I'm here with Father Ed.
All right.
Tell me when he signs off, Father.
How do I know?
We're all set, Michael?
All right. So we'll see you next week on the Regeneration Podcast. We're Michael Martin and Mike Sauter with Father Ed saying goodbye and have a good week.
Have a good day, everybody.